The truck bed was our whole world, a rattling, groaning world of damp wool and diesel fumes and the sour smell of men who'd been wearing the same uniform for weeks. We were packed in so tight, shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee, that when one man shifted his weight to ease a cramp, the whole row of us had to shift with him. I was the new fish, the fresh-faced replacement straight from the training camps near Dresden, where the war was still a game of marching and mark attacks on fields that were always dry and sunny. The veterans around me, their faces grimy and etched with a deep, silent weariness, didn't even look at me. They just stared at nothing, or with their eyes closed, trying to steal a moment of sleep as the truck lurched over another pothole. Their silence was heavier than any lecture from our Feldwebel. Back in training, we'd sing on the march, we'd boast about what we'd do to the Ivans, all that foolish bravado that young men used to paint over their fear. But here, that paint was stripped clean away. The only sound was the roar of the engine, and underneath it, a sound I'd only heard in the distance before, a low, constant thunder, like a bad storm that never moved on. Artillery. That was the reality. That was the bass note of this new world I'd been thrown into. My own fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, so intense it felt like a physical thing, a stone I'd swallowed. I kept my rifle clutched between my knees, my knuckles white, and I remember thinking, this is it, this is really it, there's no turning back now. The training camp was 1,000,000 miles away, a dream I'd once had. This shaking truck, this smell, this thunder, this was waking up. When the truck finally shuddered to a halt and the tailgate dropped with a loud clang, the world outside was a palette of mud and gloom. The air didn't just smell of mud, it tasted of it, a wet, earthy grit that got in your teeth. And the thunder was no longer a background noise. It was a physical force that you felt in your chest. A sergeant with a face like cracked leather was barking orders, his voice hoarse and barely cutting through the rumble. Ostegen, move it, dig in. This whole sector is zeroed in by their artillery, zeroed in. The words sent a fresh jolt of ice through me. It meant they had the range. They knew exactly where we were. The veterans didn't need to be told twice. They scattered like rats, grabbing their shovels and moving with a purpose I couldn't fathom. I fumbled with my own shovel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get a grip on the handle. I found a patch of ground that looked no different from any other and started to dig. The earth was cold and wet, a thick clay-like mud that clung to my shovel and made every scoop a battle. My movements were clumsy, frantic, like a dog trying to bury a bone in a hurry. I could hear the whistle now, a rising scream in the sky that got louder and closer, a sound that tore at your nerves. Then the crump of an impact, too close, shaking the ground and throwing a shower of dirt and debris over me. I dug faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the cold mud working its way under my fingernails, a gritty, filthy feeling that somehow made everything more degrading. I glanced over at the man digging next to me, an older soldier with a thick beard. He wasn't frantic. He was methodical, each movement economical and precise, carving out a neat, deep hole with a calm efficiency that seemed impossible. I felt like a child next to him, a boy playing at making a fort in the garden, while he was a man digging his own grave, or maybe his salvation, with the grim acceptance of someone who'd done it 100 times before. When the hole was deep enough to crouch in, my heart still hammering against my ribs, I did something that even then felt absurd. I pulled out my knife, the one my father had given me, a good solid blade I'd mostly used for cutting sausage. And there on the smooth wooden handle of my shovel, just below the metal collar, I carved a single deep notch, the first mark. It was a private, almost silly act. Who counts foxholes? It's not like there was a prize for the most holes dug. But in that moment, as the world exploded around me, it felt necessary. It was a point of control, the only one I had. I couldn't stop the shells, I couldn't end the war, but I could make this mark. It was a testament. I am here. I dug this hole. I survived this moment. The absurdity of it wasn't lost on Muhat if this was the only mark I ever got to make. But the simple, physical act of cutting into the wood, of feeling the curl of the splinter under my blade, gave me a fleeting anchor in that sea of chaos. It was something to hold on to, a tiny, personal ritual in a world that had stripped away all others. That first night on the line changed something in me forever. The darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating blackness that felt like it'd wait. It was broken only by the sudden, ghostly illumination of a flare arching over Naaman's land, casting long, dancing shadows that made every stump and shell crater look like a lurking enemy. And the sounds, my God, the sounds. The moaning and crying of wounded men out in that darkness, calls for help that you knew you couldn't answer, that you had to shut out of your mind just to stay sane. The sporadic rattle of a machine gun, the crack of a rifle shot. Lying in that hole, curled up at the bottom with my helmet pulled down low, I understood something fundamental. This foxhole wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a grave I was digging for myself, or a cradle that would protect me. It was the thinnest of barriers between life and whatever waited out there. The count I'd started on my shovel handle, I realized then, wasn't about the war. It wasn't about defeating the enemy or advancing for the fatherland. Those were ideas for the men in the big maps far behind the lines. For me, in the mud and the dark, the count was about something much simpler, much more desperate. It was about the days, the moments, I managed to stay alive. It was a count of reprieves. And as I shivered in the cold, listening to the death rattles of men I'd never know, I promised myself that if I lived to see the dawn, I would make another mark. And that became the entire point. Just make it to the next mark. The days bled into one another after that, a blur of exhaustion, fear, and a kind of numb acceptance. You learned the rhythm of the front, the way the shelling would often pick up at dawn and dusk, the way the mist in the morning could be your friend or your enemy. You learned to sleep through the constant rumble, to eat your cold, tasteless ersatz bread with mud-caked hands, to light a cigarette under the cover of your helmet, because the glow of a match could draw a sniper's bullet. The friendships you formed were fast and deep, forged in that shared misery. There was Klaus, a wiry kid from Hamburg who had a knack for scrounging up little luxurious a real bar of chocolate once, or a bottle of cognac that must have fallen from an officer's kit. And old Johann, the bearded veteran from my first day, who taught me how to pack the dirt so the sides of the hole wouldn't collapse, how to angle the entrance away from expected fire. He never asked about the little notches on my shovel, but I think he knew. He had his own quirks, his own ways of coping. We all did. The dark humor was our currency. When a shell landed close and showered us with dirt, someone would always quip, "Hey, they're delivering our mail early." Or another few inches and we'd be talking to St. Peter together. It sounds grim, but you had to laugh, because the alternative was to scream and never stop. I remember one time, during a lull in the fighting, we were huddled in a captured farmhouse that was little more than a skeleton of brick walls. The rain was coming down in sheets, and we were all soaked to the bone, shivering. Klaus found an old, battered harmonica, and he started to play some sad, folksy tune from home. For a few minutes, nobody spoke. We just listened, each man lost in his own thoughts, probably thinking of his family, his own village, a warm bed, a girl he'd left behind. The homesickness was a physical ache, a hollow feeling in your chest that was worse than any hunger. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, we started singing, softly at first, then a little louder. It wasn't a patriotic song, nothing about glory or the fatherland. It was just a simple song about a river and a miller's daughter. In that moment, we weren't soldiers. We were just a bunch of cold, tired, scared boys trying to remember what it felt like to be human. Those were the moments that kept you going more than any speech from a general. But the fear was always there, a constant companion. The fear of the artillery barrage that could vaporize you without warning. The fear of the attack, of seeing those figures coming out of the mist, of the close quarters fighting with bayonets and grenades, where it was just you and another man trying to kill each other. The fear of the sniper's bullet, the silent, unseen death, and the fear of being wounded, left out in the open to die slowly. I saw things in those months that I still see when I close my eyes. Saw a friend, a guy I'd shared my last cigarette with just an hour before, literally disappear in a red mist when a shell landed right on him. There was nothing left to bury. I saw men frozen in time, their faces locked in a final scream. You learn to shut down a part of yourself, to build a wall inside your mind just to get through the next minute, the next hour. And after every bombardment, after every frantic scramble to a new position, the first order was always the same. Dig in. And I would dig. The digging became a kind of therapy. The burn in my muscles, the rhythm of thrusting the shovel into the earth, the focus required to make the hole just right, it pushed the terror back, just for a little while. And when it was done, I would take out my knife, feel the familiar handle in my palm, and add another notch to the growing line on my shovel. Each mark was a small victory. Each one was a no to the chaos. I am still here. The winter was the worst. The cold was a monster that bit into your bones and never let go. Your feet were always numb, and you'd be terrified of trench foot, of having to have your toes amputated. Digging a foxhole in frozen ground was a special kind of hell. You'd have to break the crust of ice with the blade of your shovel, and the earth underneath was like iron. Your hands would be raw and bleeding, sticking to the cold metal of the shovel. One particularly bitter day, we'd been digging for what felt like hours, and my hands were so cold I could barely feel the knife when I went to make the mark. My fingers were clumsy, and I slipped, cutting a gash across my thumb. The blood was shockingly red against the pale, frozen skin. I just stared at it for a second, then wrapped a dirty rag around it and went ahead and carved the notch, smearing blood into the fresh cut in the wood. That mark, number 27, I remember it clearly. It wasn't just a count of a hole anymore. It was a part of me, my own blood mixed into the tally of my survival. The shovel was no longer just a tool. It was a diary, a ledger of misery and stubborn life. By the time the spring thaws came, turning the landscape into a bottomless sea of mud, the line of notches was long. I'd lost count of the actual number. I'd started a new row when the first one got filled, but I knew it was well over 50. The war had changed around us, too. The news wasn't good, but out on the line, you didn't think about the big picture. You thought about the next meal, the next hour of sleep, the next shell that might have your name on it. The constant retreats, the sense of everything closing in, just made the little ritual of the tally more important. It was the one constant in a world falling apart. Then, during a chaotic withdrawal across a river, our truck took a direct hit from a fighter plane. We all spilled out into a ditch, and in the panic of running for cover, I dropped my shovel. I realized it 100 yards later, my hand feeling strangely empty. I actually thought about going back for it, a crazy thought with bullets cracking all around us. But I didn't. I left it there, lying in the mud. That was the end of the official count, but the habit was too deeply ingrained. I found another shovel from a discarded kit, and that night, when we dug a new defensive line, I carved a single, deep notch into its pristine handle. I didn't start the count over. I just made the mark. It was number 1 again, or maybe it was number 50-something. It didn't matter. The number was never the point. The point was the act itself, the defiant, stubborn, maybe even foolish declaration that I was still here, that I had survived another day in this hell, and that I intended to do it again tomorrow. The secret wasn't the number. It was the need to count at all, the need to find a sliver of order in the madness, to prove to myself that I was still a man, and not just an animal waiting to die in a hole in the ground. And in the end, that's what got me through. Not patriotism, not hatred for the enemy, but that simple, private mark in a piece of wood, a testament to the most basic, most powerful instinct there is, the will to see the sun rise one more time. You know, they give you all sorts of gear when you ship out. A rifle, a helmet, a mess kit. But the thing that became my whole world, my calendar, my confessor, was this damn shovel. Standard issue, wooden handle, the steel blade already rust-spotted from the guy who had it before me. At first, it was just a tool, a heavy, clumsy thing to curse when the sergeant told us to dig in again. But out here, in the mud and the waiting, things change. Your perspective shifts. You start to find meaning in the strangest places. For me, it started out of sheer mind-numbing boredom. The worst part of this whole mess isn't always the fighting, though that's plenty bad. It's the hours, the days in between, the waiting. You're crouched in a ditch or huddled in a barn, and there's nothing to do but listen. Listen to the wind, to the distant thump of artillery that's miles away but sounds like it's right next door, to your own heart beating too fast. Your mind starts to play tricks on you. You think about home, about your girl, about a hot meal, and then you feel this ache so deep it's physical. Or worse, you think about what's coming, and the fear starts to curdle in your gut like bad milk. You've got to give your mind a job, something simple, something stupid, or it'll eat you alive. So one day, after we dug a new defensive line on the edge of some French forest that smelled of pine and damp earth, I took out my knife. The blade was dull from opening cans of corned beef, but it still bit into the wood. I carved a little notch, right near the top of the shovel handle, just one. I looked at it and thought, well, that's one. One hole. It was a joke, really. A private laugh at the absurdity of it all. But the next time we had to dig, I did it again. Another notch. And something clicked. It gave the empty days a shape. The date on a calendar back home didn't mean a thing out here. Tuesday, Friday, it was all the same grey soup of fear and fatigue. But this number, this was my time. It was a personal calendar of survival. Every notch was a day I'd made it through. I didn't tell anyone. It was my secret. A silly, stupid secret, but it was mine. And you know, I soon realized I wasn't the only one with a secret. We all had them. It was an unspoken brotherhood, not of blood or even of the unit, but of the spade. We were all just trying to keep the darkness at bay. There was Mueller, a quiet kid from Hamburg. He'd count his cigarettes. He had a special way of lining them up in his case, and he'd smoke exactly 2 a day, never more, never less. I saw him once just staring at them, counting and recounting. It was his clock. Then there was Carl, the old man of the squad at 30. He had this tiny notebook, no bigger than a matchbook, and a little nub of a pencil. He'd sketch things, not grand landscapes, just little things. A broken cartwheel, a bird on a branch, the way the steam rose from his mug in the morning cold. And Friedrich, he was a devout Catholic. He had his rosary beads. His fingers were always moving in his pocket, and you'd see his lips whispering the prayers, his eyes closed, miles away from the mud and the stink of cordite. We never talked about these rituals, not a word, but we understood. You'd de-catch another guy's eye while he was doing his thing, and you'd just give a little nod, a look that said, I know, me too, keep going. It was what kept the cracks from becoming breaks. It was the thin wire holding our sanity together. As the notches climbed, the shovel handle stopped being just a counter. It became a diary written in scars on wood. I didn't need to write the stories down. Each mark held a memory so vivid I could taste it. That 5th notch, for instance. That was the hole we dug during a blizzard that came screaming out of the east. The wind cut through your coat like it wasn't even there, and the snow mixed with the dirt into a frozen, concrete-like sludge. My fingers were so numb I could barely feel the knife when I carved the mark, but I did it, my breath pluming in the icy air. Number 14. I'll never forget number 14. I dug that one with hands. We were in a field near a little village that had been shelled to rubble. The smell of burned wood and something else, something sweet and terrible, hung in the air. Hans was a joker, always had a wisecrack, even when things were at their worst. As we dug, he was making up stories about the French farmer who owned this land, imagining him as a grumpy old man shaking his fist at us from the clouds. We were laughing, actually laughing, shoulders sore from digging but spirits weirdly high. We shared a cigarette after, sitting in the bottom of that hole, looking up at the smoke-grease sky. I carved the notch that night, thinking of his stupid jokes. By the time I carved number 20, Hans was gone. A sniper's bullet, clean and sudden, just like that. The joke was over. So when my finger runs over that little cluster of notches from 14 to 20, it's not just a number, it's his face. It's the sound of his laugh. It's the empty space where he used to be. And that's the thing about the count. It started as a comfort, a way to mark time, but after a while the number itself got heavy. It became a burden. Every new notch was a reminder of how long I'd been in this hell. It was a rope I was climbing, but I could never see the top. I'd look at it, this growing column of little lines, and wonder what it really meant. Did a high number make me lucky, a veteran, a survivor, or did it just mean I'd been rolling the dice for too long, that my luck was bound to run out? The law of averages was a ghost that sat on the edge of my hole every night. You see guys come in, fresh-faced replacements, their uniforms still clean, their eyes wide with a fear they don't even understand yet. And they're gone in a week, sometimes a day. And you're still here with your 50, 60, 70 notches. You feel guilty sometimes, and you feel scared, because you start to think you're living on borrowed time. My buddy Klaus, he said to me once during a quiet moment, he said, "France, do you ever feel like you've seen too much? Like you've used up all the feeling you're supposed to have?" He wasn't talking about the number on my shovel, but he might as well have been. The weight of it was the weight of all those days, all those close calls, all the faces that were gone. The shovel, this thing that was supposed to protect me by giving me a hole to hide in, started to feel like it was marking my own progress toward an ending. What was the final number going to be? Would I stop at 100, 200, or would the counting just stop? And that would be that. That was the fear that coiled in your stomach. The fear that the last notch you carved would be the last thing you ever did. I remember one time, near the end, it was raining. Not a storm, just a cold, steady, miserable drizzle that had been going on for days. Everything was soaked. Your socks, your tobacco, your soul. We were digging another damned hole on a hillside that was pure clay. The mud was so thick it sucked at your boots with every step, and digging was like trying to carve stone. My back ached, my hands were raw inside my wet gloves, and I just felt this overwhelming exhaustion, deeper than any sleep could fix. I finished the hole, a shallow, watery grave of a thing, and I slumped down against the side, the rain dripping off the brim of my helmet. I pulled out my knife and went to make the mark. My hand was shaking, not from fear, just from pure weariness. And for a second I hesitated. I looked at that long column of notches, all the way down the handle, and I thought, I don't want to make another one. I don't want to add to this count. I just want to go home. The weight of that number felt like it was going to press me right down into the mud. But then I thought about the ritual, the stupid, simple ritual. It had gotten me this far. It was the one thing in this chaos that I controlled. So I pressed the blade into the wood. It made a quiet, scraping sound. One more. I put the knife away and just sat there, staring at the new mark, feeling the cold rain on my face, and thinking that as long as I could still make that mark, I was still here. I was still alive, and that had to be enough. It was the only thing that was. You don't think about the dirt at first, not really. You think about the noise, the big stuff, the shells screaming in like freight trains off their tracks. But you learn, and you learn fast, that the dirt is everything. Your life depends on reading the ground like a book, looking for the little story it tells. You're not hunting for a scenic view, you're hunting for a slight rise, just a few inches, because a few inches might mean the difference between a shell fragment tearing through your chest or whistling harmlessly over your head. Your world shrinks down to the span of your own body, and you start digging. That first scoop of earth with the little folding shovel, the entrenching tool we all cursed carrying until the moment we needed it, that's when the real work begins. It starts as a scrape, then a shallow grave you lie in, and you keep digging, your arms burning, your back screaming, until you're down deep enough that the world is just a narrow strip of sky above you. That's when the craftsmanship starts. It's not just a hole, it's your home. You sculpt it. You carve out a firing step so you can stand up and see over the edge without exposing your whole body. You dig a little sump at the bottom, a pit for the water to drain into, because the water always comes, seeping up from below or pouring in from the rain. You smooth out a place for your head, a little niche for your rifle. You're an architect of survival, and your medium is mud and clay and roots. And this hole, this muddy, cold, cramped prison, it becomes the only place you feel safe. It's crazy, but it's true. Out there, you're a target. In here, you're just a man in a hole, and for a little while, that feels like enough. It transforms from something you're forced into to the only piece of the earth that's yours. My foxhole, my world. That's what we called it. There were no manuals for the important things, the things that actually kept you human. The manual told you how to clean your rifle, how to salute, but it never mentioned the dry pair of socks. You learned that from the old-timers, the guys who'd been in it since Africa or Sicily. They'd tell you, keep a pair dry no matter what. Keep them in a wax pouch or wrapped in oilcloth, and you only put them on in the absolute blackness of night, when you knew you had a few hours before stanto. Let me tell you, slipping on a dry pair of socks in the middle of all that mud and misery was a feeling better than any medal they could ever pin on your chest. It was a tiny piece of home, a small defiance against the damp that chilled you to the bone. And then there was the photograph. I had one of my wife, Anna, and my little boy, Carl, tucked right into the webbing of my tunic next to my heart. The edges got soft from the sweat and the rain, the image itself getting a little blurry, but I didn't need to see it clearly anymore. I knew every line of their faces by heart. You'd look at it in the faint light of dawn, your fingers tracing the outline, and for a second you weren't in a hole in France or Belgium. You were back in our little kitchen, smelling the coffee. And my knife. Just a simple, sharp knife. It was for everything. For opening a can of corned beef when your hands were shaking so bad you couldn't work the key, for cutting a bandage if someone got hit, for whittling a piece of wood to pass the time, and for making the tallies. I never told anyone about that, not even my buddy Hans. It started after a big attack, a real close thing. We'd been digging like madmen all night, and when the sun came up, I looked at the fresh, raw earth of my new hole, and I just took out my knife and carved a little notch into the handle. One, just to mark it. To say I was here, I survived this one. It became a ritual. Every new foxhole, I'd add another notch. It wasn't pride, not really. It was more like counting the days on a prison wall. It was a secret count, a ledger of survival. Each notch was a place I'd cheated death for another few hours, another night. You developed a strange relationship with the earth itself. You'd whisper into the dirt walls, your lips almost touching the soil. You'd mutter your fears, your prayers, things you'd never say out loud to another living soul. Just let me see them one more time. You'd deep-breathe into the ground, as if the earth itself might listen, might absorb your terror, and offer some small protection. The smell of that hole is something I'll never forget. It wasn't just dirt. It was damp soil and decay, the rot of leaves and maybe something else, something you didn't want to think about. It was the smell of being hunted, of being buried alive but still breathing. That scent, it gets deep into your clothes, your hair, your soul. Even now, sometimes after a heavy rain, I catch a whiff of it and I'm right back there, my heart pounding, listening for the sound of boots crunching on leaves outside my little world. And that patch of ground, that miserable, muddy rectangle, it was the only constant thing in all that chaos. Officers came and went, orders changed by the hour, buddies you shared your last cigarette with were gone the next day. But the foxhole was there. It was the only thing you could rely on. It was your constant companion and your tomb. The worst part, sometimes, wasn't the digging or the shelling while you were in it. It was the leaving. When the order came to advance, to move up, you had to climb out of this hole you'd poured your sweat and your fear into. This perfectly crafted little fortress that had kept you alive. You'd abandon it, just leave it there to the rain and the wind. There was a peculiar sadness to it, like leaving a part of yourself behind. I'd always take one last look back at it, this empty scar in the earth, and I'd wonder if some other scared kid, some other soldier from another company maybe, would stumble upon it later. I'd hope he'd find it and be grateful for the work I'd done, that my labor might give him one more night of safety. It made you feel like a ghost, moving from hole to hole, each one a temporary grave you had to claw your way out of, never knowing if the next one you dug would be the one you'd stay in for good. We were all just ghosts in those fields, leaving behind empty holes as the only mark that we were ever there at all. You learn to listen to the silence, which is worse than the noise sometimes. In the noise, you're too busy trying to press yourself into the earth to think. But in the silence, that's when your mind starts working. You hear every little sound, the rustle of a mouse in the leaves, the drip of water from a branch, the sound of your own heart beating in your ears like a drum. You're listening for the one sound that doesn't belong, the crunch of a boot that isn't one of ours. Your buddy in the next hole, maybe 10 yards away, might whisper your name just to hear a voice. "France, you awake?" "Yeah, I'm awake." That's all you need. Just to know you're not alone in the dark. We had this dark humor, a way of laughing at the madness so we didn't cry. We'd give the holes names. There was one particularly miserable, water-filled ditch we called the Grand Hotel. Another one on a steep slope we called the Slide. You try to get comfortable and just end up sliding down into a puddle. You had to laugh or you go insane. We'd joke about the food, the iron rations that tasted like cardboard and despair. But that laughter was thin, and it never lasted long. Underneath it all was the cold, hard fear. The homesickness was a physical ache, a hollow feeling right in your gut. It wasn't just missing your family. It was missing a world where the sky wasn't full of fire, where the ground wasn't something you hid in. You'd remember stupid, simple things, the feel of a clean shirt, the taste of real coffee, the sound of your wife humming in the other room. Those memories were like little lifelines, but they were dangerous too, because thinking about them too much made the reality of the hole, the mud, the smell of cordite, even harder to bear. You had to lock it away, tuck it back next to your heart with the photograph, and focus on the now. Focus on the dirt in front of your face. My hands were always caked with dirt, the nails broken and black. You try to clean them with a little water from your canteen, but it was pointless. The grime was ground in, a permanent tattoo of the earth. You touch your face to wipe away sweat, and you just smear more mud on yourself. After a while, you stopped noticing. It became part of the landscape, just another animal digging in the dirt to stay alive. And the rain. Guard the rain. It would start as a drizzle, a soft patter on the leaves above, and you'd think maybe it'll pass. But it never did. It would come down in sheets, turning the world into a soupy, cold mess. The water would trickle down the walls of your foxhole, pooling at the bottom no matter how good your sump was. You'd sit there, soaked to the skin, shivering, watching the water slowly rise up your boots. There was nothing you could do but sit in it. You de-huddle under your poncho, trying to keep your rifle dry and just wait for dawn. Those were the longest nights, when the cold seeped into your bones and you wondered if you'd ever be warm again. You'd think about the tallies on my knife handle. Each one represented a night like this, a night of cold and fear that I had lived through. It was a morbid comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. I'd run my thumb over the notches in the dark, feeling the rough edges, counting them silently. 23, 24. Each one a small victory. You never knew when the day would come that you wouldn't get the chance to carve another. The attacks were a blur of noise and terror. The shelling would start, the earth shaking like a mad thing, and you press yourself as deep into your hole as you could, praying that the next one wasn't a direct hit. The air would smell of smoke and burnt powder, and your ears would ring so loud you couldn't hear anything else. Then, if it was an infantry attack, you'd hear the whistles or the shouts, and you'd have to rise up on your firing step, your heart in your throat, and look out into the smoke. You'd see shadows moving, and you'd fire your rifle, not aiming so much as pointing in the direction of the noise. It was impersonal and intimate all at once. You were trying to kill men you never met, men who were probably just as scared as you were, digging their own holes somewhere else. It was a terrible, stupid game where the prize was just getting to dig another foxhole tomorrow. And sometimes, the attack would come right up to your hole. I remember one time, a grenade landed right on the edge of my hole. I saw it, a dark lump against the sky, and time just stopped. I didn't think, I just acted. I scooped it up with the blade of my entrenching tool and flung it back out. It exploded in the air before it hit the ground. I fell back into the mud, shaking so hard I thought I'd fall apart. That was the closest I ever came. After something like that, the silence that followed was deafening. You'd look around at the familiar walls of your hole, the walls that had almost become your tomb, and you'd feel a weird gratitude towards this patch of dirt. It had saved you again. Then the guilt would set in, thinking about the men in the other holes, the ones who hadn't been so lucky. You'd hear the moans, the cries for a medic, and you'd feel helpless. All you could do was stay in your hole and wait. The medics were the bravest men I ever saw, running through all that hell to try and save a life. When it was finally over, and the all clear was given, the exhaustion would hit you like a physical blow. You slumped down in the mud, too tired to even be scared anymore. You'd check your rifle, clean the mud out of the action, and just stare at nothing. That's when the small routines kept you sane. You pull out your wax pouch and change into your dry socks, a small ritual of renewal. You take out the photograph of Anna and Carl and just hold it, not even looking at it, just feeling it in your hand. You get out your knife, and with hands that were still trembling, you'd carve another notch, another foxhole, another day. The number kept climbing. It became a strange point of pride, but also a heavy weight. The more notches there were, the longer the odds felt. How long could your luck possibly hold? You'd see replacements come in, boys with clean uniforms and scared eyes, and they'd look at you like you were some kind of veteran, like you knew what you were doing. They didn't understand that none of us knew what we were doing. We were all just making it up as we went along, clinging to our little patches of earth for dear life. I'd watch them dig their first foxhole, too shallow, too exposed, and I'd want to go over and show them, tell them to dig deeper, to angle it this way, to make a proper sump. But you kept to yourself mostly. Everyone had their own way of coping. My way was my knife and my secret tally. It was my way of marking time, of measuring the war not in miles gained or lost, but in holes dug and survived. The war ended, as all wars do, and I went home. I came back to Anna and Carl, back to a world without shelling, without the constant fear. I tried to leave it all behind, the mud, the noise, the smell. I threw away my uniform, I burned my letters. But you can't ever really leave it all behind. It's in you, deep down. For years afterwards, I couldn't stand the smell of wet earth. It would send me right back. I'd be working in my garden, and my trowel would hit a stone, and the sound would make me flinch. I had nightmares, of course. We all did. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I was back in the hole, listening for the sound of the attack. But slowly life goes on. You learn to live with the ghost. I never told anyone about the notches on my knife. It felt too private, too much a part of that other France, the boy soldier who lived in the ground. That knife is in a box in my attic now, along with my dog tags and a few other things. I take it out sometimes when the house is quiet. I hold it in my hand, and I feel the weight of it. I run my thumb over those notches, one by one. 57. There are 57 little cuts in that handle. 57 times I dug a hole in the earth and prayed it would be enough. 57 times I said goodbye to a small piece of myself I left behind in the mud. People talk about the big battles, the generals, the strategy. But for me, the war was always right there, in the few feet of dirt I could call my own. It was in the smell of the soil, the ache in my arms from digging, the comfort of a dry pair of socks, and the secret tally I kept, a silent prayer carved into a piece of steel. That was my war. That was the world I lived in, a world of foxholes. You want to know my secret? The one I carried all through Russia, through the mud and the snow and the screaming metal. It wasn't a map to some treasure or the location of a partisan cell. No, it was simpler than that, and in its own way much darker. I kept a count, a tally, not of men well, not that, never that. I couldn't bear to keep that kind of score. My count was of foxholes. Every single one I dug, I'd carve a little notch into the wooden handle of my entrenching tool, right near the blade where my hand would cover it. Just a small, secret mark, a tiny victory against the earth, against the chaos. It started somewhere outside Smolensk, I think, when the shaking in my hands got so bad I could barely light a cigarette. The ground was hard, frozen in patches, and the order came down to dig in for the night. My buddy Klaus, he was fumbling with his shovel, his fingers numb and clumsy, and he just looked at me, his eyes wide, and he said, "Hans, I just can't do it again." And I knew what he meant. It wasn't the digging, it was the knowing. The knowing that you were digging your own little piece of earth, your own potential grave, and you'd be sitting in it all night, listening, waiting for the whistle that meant you might never get out. So I started counting. I focused on nothing but the number. Not the 10th time a shell landed close enough to spray dirt in your face. Not the way the guy 2 holes over cried for his mother all night, until he went quiet at dawn. Not the smell of cordite and blood and fear sweat that never, ever leaves your clothes. Just the number. This is number 14, I'd whisper to myself, the words a mantra against the madness. 14, just focus on making the walls straight. 14, make it deep enough. 14. The physical act of digging, of driving that shovel into the ground, of feeling the strain in your shoulders and back, it was something real, something you could control. You couldn't control whether a T-34 crested the next hill. You couldn't control the Stukas screaming overhead, but you could control the depth of this hole. You could make the sides smooth. You could carve your little mark when it was done. And for those minutes, or if we were lucky, those hours, the terror was held at bay. It was like building a dam in your mind, and each shovelload of dirt was another sandbag against the flood. I knew with a certainty that was colder than the Russian winter, that if I ever stopped counting, if I ever let that focus slip, the horror would rush in and I'd be finished. I'd end up like poor France, who just stood up one morning during a mortar barrage and walked straight towards the enemy lines, a blank smile on his face, humming some folk song. The counting kept me sane. Or maybe it was its own kind of insanity, but it was the one that let me put one foot in front of the other. And the sound, you'd think the sound of war is all explosions and rifle fire, and it is, God knows, but there's another sound that's just as much a part of it, at least for us infantry, the sound of the shovel, that scrape and chunk of the blade biting into the soil. Against rocks, it was a grinding screech. In thick clay, it was a wet, sucking pull. After a while, it became almost comforting. It was a familiar sound, a human sound, in the middle of all that inhuman noise. When the world was erupting around you, the rhythm of digging stab, step, lift, throw it could sometimes, for a few precious seconds, drown out the other sounds. The moans from the casualty collection point, the screams of the shell-shocked, the frantic shouts of officers. In that rhythm, you weren't a soldier, you weren't a killer, you were just a man trying to make a hole to hide in. A man trying to stay alive, just like the man digging 10 meters to your left and the man to your right. That sound identified you to each other. When you heard it up and down the line, you knew you weren't alone. We were all just moles, scared little animals burrowing into the earth, and the symphony of our shovels was a chorus of shared fear and desperate hope. Sometimes, when things got quiet, eerily quiet, you'd hear it from the Russian lines too, that same scraping sound. And you'd think, they're digging in just like us. They're scared just like us. They have mothers, maybe wives, just like us. For a moment, the monster you were told you were fighting became just another boy with a shovel, and that was a thought you had to bury quick, because it was harder to hate a man when you heard him digging his own grave, same as you. But the tally, it wasn't a perfect record. There were holes that never got a mark, the ones dug in a blind, panicked rush, like outside a village whose name I've forgotten, when the partisan ambush hit us on the road. We scattered into the tree line, and you just dropped and scraped at the dirt with your hands and your helmet, anything to get a few inches of cover. Those holes were shallow, pathetic things, more like animal burrows than proper fighting positions. You'd lie there, your heart hammering against the dirt, feeling completely exposed, knowing a single grenade could end it all. There was no time for neat sides, no time for a measured depth, and certainly no time to take out my shovel and carefully carve a notch. Those were the worst times because the counting stopped. The fear rushed in like a tidal wave, and all you could do was cling to the earth and pray. Those days are a blur in my memory, a smear of terror and noise, and the tally has no record of them. They're the blank spaces, the days I truly lost. And then there were the holes that became graves. That's the part of the story they never tell you about war. You dig a hole to live, and sometimes it becomes a hole to bury your friends in. I remember we had to fall back from a position near a river, and we couldn't take our dead with us. The order was to bury them where they fell. Klaus, it was Klaus from that first day. A piece of shrapnel, no bigger than a coin, but it found a place the steel helmet couldn't protect. We laid him in the foxhole he'd been sharing with me. It was the one I'd marked as 37. As we shoveled the dirt back over him, my hand went to the handle of my tool out of habit, to add the mark for the new hole I'd have to dig when we stopped again. But my fingers froze. I couldn't do it. How could I add a notch for digging a grave for my friend? It felt like a blasphemy. So that number is missing too. The tally has its gaps, its silences, and those silences are louder than any number. They're the holes that hold my guilt, the days that were just a raw, screaming struggle to survive, where the only victory was drawing breath when the sun went down. As the war dragged on, and the numbers on my shovel handle grew, I started to think about what they really meant. Was a high number something to be proud of? Did it mean I was a good soldier, a survivor? Or did it mean I was a coward, always digging in, always retreating, always finding a new patch of dirt to hide in? The heroes in the propaganda films, they charged forward with bayonets fixed. They didn't spend their war counting the scrapes of a shovel. My war was measured in cubic meters of displaced earth. It wasn't a count of victories, of towns captured. It was a count of days endured, of small, private battles fought against despair. Each notch was a night I didn't go mad, a day I didn't give up. It was a measure of how many times I told myself, just one more. Dig one more, and you might live to see home. You see, the real secret wasn't the number itself. Anyone could have seen the marks on my shovel, though no one ever did, or if they did, they never asked. The real secret was what the number represented, the fragile, stubborn, terrified human spirit trying to hold itself together. It was the story of a boy who wanted to be an engineer, who liked to tinker with radios, who loved a girl named Elsa back in Hamburg, forced to become an expert in digging his own grave, over and over again. The last foxhole I ever dug was in the spring of '45, somewhere in what's now Poland. The front had collapsed. It was every man for himself. I was separated from my unit, just wandering, trying to go west, towards the Americans. I stumbled into a deserted farmyard, and the sound of artillery was getting closer. Old habit took over. I found a spot behind a crumbling stone wall and started to dig. The ground was soft from the thaw, and the hole came together quickly. It was a good hole, deep, with a nice firing step. A professional job. When I was finished, I sat in the bottom of it, the cool earth against my back, and I took out my entrenching tool. The handle was covered in marks, dozens and dozens of them, a lifetime of fear carved into a piece of wood. I took out my knife, and I started to carve the last notch. Number, I don't even know. I'd lost count long ago, but I made the mark. And as I did, I heard the rumble of vehicles. Not the high-pitched whine of our half-tracks, but the deeper, throatier sound of American engines. I looked over the edge of my hole, and I saw a column of Sherman tanks rolling down the road towards the farm. Stood up slowly, my hands in the air. I was tired, so tired. A young American soldier, he couldn't have been more than 19, jumped down from a jeep, his rifle pointed at me. He was cautious, his eyes scanning the yard. He gestured for me to drop my weapon. I let my rifle fall to the ground. Then he gestured to my shovel, which was still in my other hand. I suppose it looked like a weapon to him. I looked at it for a long moment, at all those secret marks, all those days and nights of my life. Then I dropped it into the mud of the Foxhole. I left my secret there in that last hole, in the dirt of a country I never wanted to be in. That young American soldier, he never knew what it was. To him, it was just a dirty piece of equipment, a spoil of war. But to me, it was everything. It was the tally and the trauma. It was the price of going home. And when he led me away to the prison war column, I didn't look back. I just walked, one foot in front of the other, not counting anything anymore. You know, they give you all sorts of things when you join up. A rifle, a uniform, a mess tin. But the thing that really stays with you, the thing that becomes a part of you, is your shovel. This little folding thing, a clapspate, they call it. It's always there, strapped to your belt or your pack, clanking against your hip bone. At first, it's just a tool, a piece of steel and wood. But after a while, after the first 100 holes maybe, it stops being just a tool. It becomes something else. It becomes the thing that keeps you alive for another hour, another night. And my shovel, this one right here, it's got a story carved into its handle. Not with a knife, nothing so deliberate. Just notches, worn into the wood from the friction of my grip, from digging in rocky soil, from scraping against frozen ground. I can feel them with my thumb, each one a little smoother than the last. There are 187 of them. I know that number like I know my own birthday. 187 foxholes. It's a number that doesn't mean a thing to anyone else in the whole world. The High Command, they've got their maps with pins and their casualty counts, numbers that mean something to them. But my number, 187, that's my war. That's the true count of it. You get a feeling, a certain kind of tiredness that settles deep in your bones, deeper than any sleep can fix. It's the weight of the wood in your hands, the ache in your shoulders from driving that blade into the earth over and over again. You're not just digging a hole, you're clawing out a little piece of safety, a grave you hope you don't have to stay in. The first few inches are easy, then you hit the hardpan, or the tree roots that feel like iron cables, or the permafrost that rings your shovel like a bell. Your hands blister, then the blisters break, and then they callous over. After a while, you don't even feel it anymore. The shovel, it's like an extension of your own arm. You learn the rhythm of it, the thrust, the step, the pull, the toss. You could do it in your sleep, and you almost do. There's a strange kind of intimacy to it. This hole, this little scar in the earth, it's yours. For a few hours, or a day if you're lucky, it's the only home you have. You learn every contour of it, every lump of dirt you can use as a pillow, every spot where the water pools when it rains. It's a tool for life, this shovel, but you're always digging a grave, either for the enemy or for yourself. You try not to think about that part. And when you're down in that hole, especially when the shelling starts and you're pressed up against the cold dirt, your face buried in the mud, that's when you see them. The faces. You stare into the wall of the hole, and it's like looking into one of those fuzzy photographs. You see the guys you dug this same kind of hole with months ago, 1,000 miles ago. Like little Schmidt, fresh from Hamburg, couldn't have been more than 17. He had this ridiculous, high-pitched laugh. We were digging in near some god-forsaken village in Ukraine, the mud so thick it could pull your boots right off. It was raining, a cold, miserable drizzle, and we were up to our knees in slop. Schmidt started slipping and sliding, and he fell face-first into the muck. He came up sputtering, covered in brown glop, and instead of getting mad, he just started laughing that squeaky laugh of his. We all joined in. For a minute, standing there in the rain, covered in mud, we forgot where we were. We dug that hole together, a big, sloppy thing that filled with water almost immediately. We spent the night bailing it out with our helmets. That was notch number 43 on my shovel. Schmidt caught a piece of shrapnel from a mortar 2 weeks later near Kharkov. Never heard him laugh again. Then there was Old Man Becker, a reservist who'd fought in the last war. He had a face like a road map and hands that were permanently stained with engine grease. He never said much, but when he did, you listened. We were digging in on a ridge. the Russian artillery walking closer and closer. The ground was hard, full of stones, and we were sweating and cursing. Becker, he just worked steadily, his movements economical, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Probably had. During a lull, when the only sound was our panting and the scrape of the shovels, he looked at me and said, "The hole doesn't care who wins the war, son. It just is. It's the only honest thing out here." Then he went back to digging. We finished that hole, notch 78, just as the sun was going down. Becker lit a cigarette, offered me one, and we sat in silence, watching the tracers light up the sky in the distance. He stayed behind with a machine gun crew to cover our pullback a month later. I don't know what happened to him. Probably nothing good. That's the thing about the tally. It's not just a number. Each notch is connected to a name, a face, a story that got cut short. A joke shared in a lull, a shared cigarette when the rations were low, the silent understanding when you both know the attack in the morning is going to be a bloody mess. You remember the last words they said to you. "See you on the other side." Or "Save some of that black bread for me." Or sometimes, nothing at all, just a nod. And then they're gone, and you're digging another hole, alone or with a new face, and you add another notch to the handle, and you try to push the memory down deep because if you don't, you'll go mad. The tally is a ledger of absence. It's the weight of all those ghosts riding there on my shovel handle. There are times, in the quiet moments, when I try to write a letter home in my head. I want to tell them what it's really like. I want to tell my mother about the cold that gets into your bones and never leaves, a cold that a fireplace back home could never hope to thaw. I want to tell my father about the fear, a sharp, metallic taste in your mouth that's always there, especially when you hear the whistle of a shell that you know has your name on it. I want to tell my sister about the strange, dark humor that gets you through the day, the jokes you make about things that would horrify any decent person back in the world. But when I finally get a pencil and a piece of paper, all that comes out is the same lie everyone writes. "I am fine. The food is bad. Hope you are all well." How do you find the words? How do you describe the sound a man makes when he's dying, or the smell of cordite and corruption that hangs over everything, or the hollow feeling in your chest when you realize the guy you were talking to an hour ago is now just a memory? You can't. So you don't. You keep it all inside. And this secret count, this 187, it becomes the truest letter I never sent. It's the real record of my war. It's the story of the cold and the fear and the friends, all boiled down to a number worn into a piece of wood. A story I'll probably never tell out loud, not really. Who would understand? And that leads you to the big question, the one that keeps you awake at night when the front is quiet. What happens when the counting stops? What happens if, by some miracle, I actually get to go home? The war ends, and they tell us we can put our shovels down. What then? Will I ever be able to dig a hole again? Will I be in my garden trying to plant a tree for my mother, and the feel of the earth, the smell of it, will it bring all of this back? Will I drop the spade and start shaking? Or will it be just gardening, a simple, peaceful thing? I don't know. I try to imagine the final tally. Will it be 188, 200? Will it be a number I can look back on with a grim sense of pride? I survived. I dug 200 holes and I lived. Or will it just be a number soaked in sorrow, a count of all the times I had to bury myself to stay alive? The deepest fear, the one I can barely admit to myself, is about who I'll be when this is over. Right now, I'm a soldier. That's all I am. I'm the man who digs foxholes. It's what defines my days, my nights, my very existence. It's a horrible definition, but it's a definition. It's something to hold on to. But if I survive, if I make it back to a world without shelling and without fear, who will I be then? Will I be able to just be a man again? A son, a brother, maybe a husband, a father? Or will I always be the man with the notches on his shovel, jumping at loud noises, seeing faces in the dirt? What happens to a man when the one thing that defined him, even if it was a nightmare, is suddenly gone? That's the scariest part of all. Not the shells, not the bullets, but the silence that comes after, and the question of what you're supposed to do with yourself when you're no longer a man defined by the foxholes he dug. You wonder if you'll just feel empty, like the hole itself, just a scar on the landscape, waiting for time to slowly fill you in.